This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Over the years, I've looked at a whole bunch of mechanics and keyword abilities, and today we're looking at another one, Delirium. Delirium made its debut in Shadows over Innistrad. It is a threshold-like mechanic in that it checks for a certain number of things in your graveyard, and if you meet that requirement, you get some sort of bonus. In the case of Delirium, it checks for card types, and once you've got 4 of them, you get an upgrade. For example, Descend Upon the Sinful goes from being a 6-mana board wipe to being a 6-mana board wipe that gives you a 4/4 flyer. We actually haven't seen this mechanic that much. It's only been in Shadows over Innistrad block and Modern Horizons 2, and there's only 49 cards in total that feature the mechanic. But, like a lot of graveyard mechanics, it's had an outsized impact on the game and has affected every single format. Of those 42 cards, 16 of them have found success at Magic's highest level of competition, and despite the low number of cards with the mechanic, it took 13 points just to make the list, which is pretty impressive with so few cards. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes Pro Tours and World Championships, for example, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and this includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. One last thing before we get to the list, there are now a lot of different ways you can support the channel. You can of course subscribe and watch the videos, which is the most important of all, but you can also support me on Twitch, Patreon, or right here on YouTube with a membership. There's also Nitsahone merch now available. Alright, let's get to our list. At number 10, it is Mind Rack Demon. This comes with some great stats as a 4-mana 4/5 with flying and trample, and when it enters the battlefield, it mills the top 4 cards of your library. Obviously, that can go a long way towards setting up Delirium. In the case of Mind Rack Demon, you get to ignore its downside if you have Delirium active, and if you don't have it active, you lose 4 life every upkeep. The good news is, most decks that are interested in Delirium will probably have it going pretty easily by the time this comes down, especially because he helps you get there. While in Standard, the Demon was played primarily in Delirium-centric decks like Golgari Constrictor, Golgari Aggro, and Golgari Delirium. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, though. At number 9, it is Gnarlwood Dryad. It has the same total score as Mind Rack Demon, but more Pro Tour top 8, so I gave it the edge. This starts out as a very reasonable 1-mana 1/1 with Death Touch and becomes a 3/3 if you have Delirium, so it gives you great stats and it can trade with anything thanks to Death Touch. Basically, it's a Delirium-based version of Nimble Mongoose. It was played in a wide variety of standard decks and actually saw a lot more play in decks like Temur, Emerge, and Collected Company than it did in decks that were more focused on Delirium. So far, it doesn't have any points outside of Standard, though it does see a bit of play in Modern Death's Shadow. At number 8, it's Pick the Brain. Without Delirium, this sorcery is basically an upgraded version of Coercion since it exiles any non-land from your opponent's hand. That usually isn't good enough to see play, but the Delirium upgrade here is pretty sweet, as it gives you a lobotomy effect and allows you to strip every single copy of the card that you take from their hand from their deck. This is better than a lot of lobotomy effects are, because many of them don't actually let you trade straight up for a card in your opponent's hand, and this one makes sure you always do. The downside is that you can't just name any card you want, but it's still pretty potent at disrupting decks. It was a frequent sideboard card while in Standard, and it's also played a little bit in Modern, though it doesn't have any points there yet. The first 3 cards on this list have all only found success in Standard, but all of the cards remaining on the list have had significant multi-format success, like our number 7 card, which is To the Slaughter. Without Delirium, it's a pretty underpowered Edict effect, one that costs 3 mana to make an opponent sacrifice a creature or a planeswalker. But in this case, the Delirium upgrade makes your opponent sacrifice both a creature and a planeswalker. Planeswalkers are pretty heavily played in most formats, so To the Slaughter manages to get a 2-for-1 a decent chunk of the time. In Standard, it was of course played in Delirium decks as well as Blue-Black Control. Outside of Standard, it's also found significant success in Legacy, a format with lots of heavily played powerhouse planeswalkers like Jace the Mind Sculptor and Karn the Great Creator. As long as Legacy is a format with a reasonable number of creature and planeswalker decks around, To the Slaughter is going to continue to see play in control decks in that format. At number 6, it is Invasive Surgery. This is a narrow counterspell. It can only hit sorceries, but it's pretty nice that it can hard counter them for only a single blue mana. Once you have Delirium going, it does something similar to Pick the Mind. It lets you take every single copy of the card you countered out of your opponent's deck, hand, and graveyard, and that's some pretty significant disruption, especially because it's tacked on to a 1 mana, 1-for-1. It was played a bit in Standard, but it was a little too narrow to be something that saw regular play in the format. However, it has found significant success in formats with more targets, like Pioneer and Legacy. It's a common sideboard card in both of those formats. In Pioneer, it's often used by Arclight Phoenix decks. It's played the most though in Legacy, where it has regularly been featured as a sideboard card as a result of Miracle decks, which are heavily reliant on powerful sorceries. Miracle decks aren't as big of a factor in Legacy right now as they have been, and it's only gained 2 points there over the last 2 years as a result. However, Pioneer does look like a format where it will continue to see some play, so it is a good shot at moving up this list. At number 5, it is Grim Flayer. This starts out as a 2-mana 2/2 with Trample that gives you some card selection when it hits your opponent. And it, of course, can also help you get Delirium with that effect, since you can choose to put any number of your top 3 cards into your graveyard. This can allow him to get Delirium rather quickly, while also powering up your other Delirium cards, and once he has Delirium himself, he becomes a 2-mana 4/4 with Trample, which is pretty impressive. Unsurprisingly, the Flayer has been played in various graveyard-based aggro decks in Standard, Modern, and Pioneer, but he doesn't have any points since 2020, and his position on this list is probably in trouble going forward. At number 4, it is Dragon's Rage Channeler. So far, every card on this list has been from Shadows over Innistrad block, but that isn't the case for the Channeler, who's from Modern Horizons 2. It's a 1-mana 1/1 that surveils 1 when you cast a non-creature spell, and that means it's another card with Delirium that can help you get Delirium. And when you do, it turns into a 3/3 flyer that has to attack every turn. Because it was printed in Modern Horizons 2, that means it was never legal in Standard or Pioneer, but it has done a lot of work in other formats. And it's also available on Magic Arena, so it's legal in Historic. And in Historic, Modern, and Legacy, it's played in decks with big spell themes like Arclight Phoenix and Delver, and it's going to keep gaining points in those formats going forward. It's hard to beat the Channeler's efficiency, as it gives many decks a second Delver of Secrets-like creature that is a 1-mana 3-power flyer. At number 3, it is Ishkana, Graph Widow. Without Delirium, Ishkana is not a great card. She's a 5-mana 3/5 with reach and an expensive spider payoff. However, if you can get Delirium going, she adds a ton to the board very efficiently. She becomes a 5-mana 3/5 that also gives you 3 1/2s with reach that synergize with her activated ability. That's a heck of a deal, and also the kind of thing that aggro decks will have basically no chance of punching through. Ishkana was pretty heavily played in Standard, in decks that could easily get Delirium going, and this included dedicated Sultai and Golgari Delirium decks, but also decks like Golgari Constrictor and various energy decks. She's also gained points in Pioneer Delirium decks and World Gorger Dragon decks in Legacy. These decks look to combine the World Gorger with Animate Dead, which lets you create a cycle where all your stuff gets exiled and comes back into play, including your lands, and you can tap them for mana every time. You can combine that infinite mana with Ishkana to kill your opponent. She's still gaining points, but not at the most impressive rate, so it's inevitable that Dragon's Rage Channeler is going to overtake her. At number 2, it is Traverse the Ulvenwald. In its base form, Traverse lets you pay 1 green mana to search up a basic land. While that's not amazing, it does help you fix your mana. Once you have Delirium going, it lets you tutor up any creature or land, and for lands, that now means you can get non-basics. 1 mana for a tutor that flexible is really powerful. It saw a lot of play in Standard, being played in lots of Golgari decks, including, of course, Delirium decks. One of the decks with the Delirium sub-theme was Golgari Constrictor, and it was fairly reliant on getting Winding Constrictor in play, so it was nice that Traverse could search it up for you. It was also played in Modern for a while in the Death Shadow variant, commonly called Traverse Shadow. This was a Jund deck built around rapidly lowering your life and winning with a huge Death Shadow, which of course the Traverse could help you search for. While that is no longer the most popular form of the deck, it does still see a bit of play in Modern these days, and it's also found significant success in Pioneer Delirium decks, and it's even played in Legacy Food Chain, though so far it doesn't have any points in that format. It's likely to keep gaining points, but the number 1 card on this list is probably always going to outpace it, and that card is Unholy Heat. Like Dragon's Rage Channeler, Unholy Heat was printed in Modern Horizons 2. That means it's a card that was printed 5 years after most of the cards on this list, and yet it already occupies the number 1 slot. It's not hard to see why. Without Delirium, it's a passable removal spell, since it can do 2 damage to a creature or planeswalker for 1 mana. Then, once you get Delirium, it becomes insanely efficient, doing 6 damage to your target, an incredible amount for only a single red mana. This amazing efficiency is what has resulted in Unholy Heat quickly impacting every single format it's legal in. It's already a staple in both Historic and Modern, and while it's played less in Legacy, it has already amassed some significant points there too. As long as there are red decks in those 3 formats, I think we can count on Unholy Heat continuing to gain points at an impressive rate, and I can't imagine any other card on this list will ever get close to catching it. It's simply one of the best red removal spells we've ever seen. So, those are the cards with Delirium that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in getting cards with 4 or more card types into your graveyard and you want to buy some of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past editions of MTG Top 10, including dozens more that look at mechanics and keywords, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, check out the description where you can find lots of ways to do that. Thanks for watching.